Hello, everyone. As you all know, my name is Taylor Brown, and today we're going to go on a little seabird adventure. For my PhD, as Dean mentioned, I'm studying the phenomenon of seabird stranding specifically, and whether they are caused by light attraction. I'm going to tell you all about what seabird strandings are, so don't worry if that's kind of a novel concept. And just in case you'd like to follow me on Twitter like Dean does, my handle's there, it's at @tbrown_birds. And I often post about updates to my research and just various musings and science stuff. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, of course, what is a seabird stranding? To give you an example, let's go to Newfoundland. In autumn there every year, people notice small dark birds fluttering around at night and crashing into the walls of various buildings, unfortunately. These clumsy night creatures are young Leach's storm-petrels. In case you've never seen one, there's a picture there for you. And they get stranded as they're just leaving their nests on a nearby island and trying to find their way to the open ocean for the first time. And the same thing happens to a small portion of storm-petrel fledglings every year when they're leaving their burrows in the fall. And it happens to other fledgling seabirds elsewhere in the world too, unfortunately. And so for the sake of this presentation, it's these sort of events that I'm going to call strandings. So I'm going to play a little video for you here. Hopefully it works. The audio is not super important, but hopefully the video itself works. It's just to give you an idea of what stranding looks like for a lot of the affected seabirds. And it'll show Leach's storm-petrels, just like in that last picture, colliding with the walls of a building and dropping to the ground. So it's kind of alarming to see, but generally they're okay. And so once they drop to the ground, they're vulnerable to predation by stray cats and other predators. And some of them are able to fly somewhat. And it's usually just short distances though, because they can't really stay airborne without more of a runway or a breeze, because they're kind of used to jumping off of, steep hills and cliffs or, getting a start on the water. So they have a bit of a hard time taking off from the ground like this. So this will give you an idea. You guys should see the works of the wall. It's raining. So that particular night, I think we picked up about 400 birds, and the following night was over 1,000 in one night around this one building. So not even a whole town, not a big area, just one big industrial building that's well lit, over 1,000 birds in one night. So gives you a bit of an idea of the problem and what it looks like. So nowadays we know that seabird strandings happen all over the world. And according to a review paper published in 2017, we know that more than 50 seabird species have been reported stranded on about 50 islands, 3 continental locations, and across all the world oceans. So it really is a global phenomenon. And we also know that strandings are mostly restricted to burrow nesting, so birds that literally nest underground, night fledging, so birds that leave their nest for the first time at night, tube-nosed seabirds. So they have a tube on their nose, just like this bird in the upper right picture, the Leach's storm-petrel. And so this includes birds like shearwaters and storm-petrels in this big square on the seabird family tree. And but one interesting member of the stranded seabird crew, and the exception to that rule of it being mostly tube-nosed seabirds, is Atlantic puffins, which are alcids, and they're therefore pretty distantly related to the tube-nosed seabirds, as you can see by this seabird family tree. The tube noses are separated from alcids by about 64 million years of evolution, with everything from like pelicans to flamingos in between. And so what these stranded Atlantic puffin fledglings have in common with the tube-nosed seabird fledglings that get stranded is that they're all colonial, they're all burrow nesting, as I mentioned, they're all night fledging species. So it seems to be something to do with these natural history traits rather than something that's genetically hardwired in them. that causes them to get stranded. And the trouble with seabird strandings is, and I alluded to this before, it's nighttime when it happens, and more often than not, the birds are flying to and landing in inland locations where they can no longer see or hear the ocean to find it again. And there's often buildings and other obstacles that block their view of the ocean, of course. And so they have a hard time getting airborne in the first place, combined with not, knowing where they are or how to get back to the ocean. So they don't really know where to go. Sorry, I'm just seeing that there's a lot of stuff in the chat. Is this okay? I want to make sure it wasn't people saying, we can't hear you. And so these birds, once they get stranded, they don't know where to go. So they end up hunkering down and trying to hide. But being stranded like this obviously makes them extremely vulnerable to predation by gulls and foxes and outdoor cats. Actually, there's a lot of them in Newfoundland for whatever reason. And to being hit by cars, of course. This particular bird in the picture, a puffin fledgling, is on the road. And you can see that there's two shadows going out behind it from the two headlights on my car when I found it. And so these guys are really easily hit by cars, sadly. And so while this source of mortality, fortunately, doesn't seem to be a huge burden for most seabird populations, it's a very small proportion of them that get stranded and killed. It is definitely a concern in endangered populations that are affected by stranding, where the entire population of the whole species is quite small, and any number of birds getting killed from stranding is not good for endangered species, of course. And so the cause of these strandings, as reported in the scientific literature since about the 1960s, when they became widely known, is thought to be attraction toward artificial lights, since there has never really seemed to be a more obvious cause. So that is, the birds tend to be in decent body condition, they're not parasitized or diseased, they get stranded in oftentimes quite fair weather, so it's not like they're getting pushed in by bad weather usually. And most notably, they're predominantly found flying and becoming stranded near lights. So just to give you an idea, these are some titles from papers studying seabird strandings in the decades since it became widely known. And they pretty much all blame it on artificial lights and light attraction. And there's additional support for this hypothesis from a couple of experiments from that found fewer fledglings became stranded in locations when the lights were shielded or turned off. So again, it's like, well, if you turn off lights and fewer birds show up, maybe it has something to do with the lights. There's also an interesting effect of moon phase on stranding numbers that bolsters the light attraction hypothesis. So when the moon is full, fewer birds are found stranded compared to when it's a new moon, interestingly enough. So it's thought from this that seabird fledglings might use the moon to navigate, and that artificial lights disorient them and attract them, especially when the moon is not visible to guide them. However, there have not really been many of those experiments conducted to test for light attraction behavior in seabirds that are affected by stranding. There's a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence, like that point I mentioned about finding birds near lights, but there hasn't really been many experiments done to test, okay, are they getting stranded due to light attraction, or is it something else? And I should also mention what evidence there is for light attraction is for tube-nosed species only. Nobody's really done research on light attraction in Atlantic puffin fledglings. So since Leach's storm-petrels in the top photo, which are tube noses, and Atlantic puffins in the bottom photo, which are alcids, both nest in Newfoundland and both become stranded while fledging in Newfoundland, I decided this was a pretty good opportunity to test both species for light attraction behavior using a couple different behavioral experiments. And the great thing is puffins fledge in August and petrels fledge in October, so I didn't have to juggle both species at the same time. So I'm going to get into the experiments now. Hopefully I haven't lost anyone yet. For the first two experiments, I captured stranded fledglings and brought them back to my experiment headquarters, my mad scientist headquarters. And in this case, I just used 2 U-Haul storage trailers for the puffin experiment. So it wasn't very high tech at all. That's why the joke about being a mad scientist is funny. Haha. And so in the first experiment, called a Y-maze choice test, birds were placed in the first box of this Y-shaped maze in the picture on the left and allowed to choose between 2 arms, which I've got those yellow arrows there to show. The arms had different types of lights or darkness at the end, and if they didn't go down either arm, it was considered to be a third choice, actually, in our analyses, which we simply called remained, just meaning they remained in the main section of the maze and didn't choose the 2 options that we gave them. And we used baby monitor cameras to see through holes in the choice boxes as to whether the bird chose one side or the other. So just for fun, I've included a little video showing a puffin choosing box 2 in this case, as you'll see on the baby monitor screen there in a moment. There he is, and his little tail at the end. So it was always quite cute to watch them, actually, because they're pretty spunky little birds. So in the Y-maze choice test that I just described, I wanted to determine if puffin and petrel fledglings exhibit light attraction behavior in an experimental setting, and I'll explain how I did that. And I also wanted to determine if they prefer certain types or colors of light over others. The reason I wanted to test for preferences of certain light types and colors was so that I might be able to inform decisions about building on coastlines near seabird colonies, as to which types of light might be less attractive and therefore cause fewer strandings. So there's a very applied reason for doing that part of the experiment. So I allocated puffin and petrel fledglings to 5 different treatment groups. So that's a lot of birds. And each treatment group had 2 different light choices provided. The first treatment group was high pressure sodium light, which is what's traditionally used in streetlights, versus darkness. The second was high pressure sodium versus dimmer high pressure sodium. So the same light, but 2 different brightnesses. I just wanted to see if they preferred one brightness or the other, brighter or dimmer. The third group was high pressure sodium versus warm white LED light. So to the human eye, these lights look similar in appearance, but they actually have very different spectra. Group number 4 was exposed to warm white LED and cool white LED light. So they look a little bit different, but they have similar spectra. And the 5th group was blue versus orange light to really switch it up and see if there was any sort of extreme preferences. So the most interesting results I got in this experiment were for the treatment group that tested birds in high pressure sodium light versus darkness. These graphs have the 3 choices along the bottom. So high pressure sodium versus darkness versus remaining in the main part of the maze. Those are all the 3 options on the bottom. And along the vertical axis is the number of birds that chose each of those 3 options, with puffins on the left and petrels on the right. So Atlantic puffin fledglings on the left-hand graph chose to go toward the light 10 times out of 15, and not a single bird went down the dark arm of the maze. 5 of the puffins chose to remain in the main part of the Y maze, whereas 10 of the Leach's storm-petrels preferred to remain in the main part of the maze. 6 petrels decided to go down the dark arm, and only 3 went down the light arm. So pretty different looking graphs, really. It's pretty obvious there. And I find them to be fairly interesting results, considering both species are thought to be attracted to light. So I would have thought both would go down toward the light, the high pressure sodium, more often than any other choice. So in this case, it actually seems that storm-petrels are averse to the light, which is absolutely not what I expected at all. Now, as for all those other treatment groups I used with the different types of lights I mentioned, I found no significant preferences among those light types for either species, puffins or petrels. I did find that for puffins exposed to the bright and dim high pressure sodium light, they somewhat preferred the brighter one. And the reason I did that, in addition to the high pressure sodium versus dark, was I wanted to make sure that they weren't just going to the light thinking that it was an escape route. Whereas like obviously something that's like a dark tunnel, you think there's no way out. But that's why I did this brighter and dimmer one, because I thought, well, they'll at least know in both cases that there's a way out, the bright way and the dim way. But if they choose the brighter one, then maybe there really is something to this light attraction thing, and that is what they tended to do. And I also found that storm-petrels showed significant preferences to remain in the main part of the maze rather than go toward any of the lights. So really, petrels just didn't want to go anywhere. They just wanted to stay right where I put them in the beginning. So these results support the light attraction hypothesis, at least for puffins. In the Y-maze choice test, just to sum up, puffins went toward the light. However, storm-petrels did not show any light attraction behavior, and neither species showed any preferences for certain types or colors of light over others. So it might not matter what type of light they use in towns near puffin colonies after all. It seems like all light types are attractive to puffin fledglings from this experiment anyway. So that was interesting. And then, as I showed in that picture with the two U-Haul storage trailers, I did a second experiment right away with the same birds. This one was what we call an open field test. And so in this one, a puffin or a storm-petrel was placed inside a 1 meter cube plastic box that I built. And a small GoPro style camera was placed in a hole in the ceiling of the box, and a light shone through a second hole in the ceiling. And we used the same lights and darkness treatments as in the previous Y-maze experiment. Birds were video recorded in the box for 10 minutes, and we evaluated from the video footage the amount of time each bird spent moving around the floor of the box. And in the dark treatment, obviously we couldn't see them on camera, so we actually scored it by listening to the bird's footsteps. So you can't get as much detailed information, but you can at least still know when the bird is moving versus when it's staying still. So that was pretty cool. And I also just wanted to show a little clip of what a petrel looks like in the open field test under a cool white LED light. They're very cute, just like puffins. So maybe it's boring for most people. I actually had to watch 107 videos that are 10 minutes long of puffins walking around that arena. Or sometimes they just sat still, so I had to still stare at them sitting in the same spot for 10 minutes and manually score the behavior. That's why I had to watch them. Anyway, so in this experiment, we reasoned that birds who spent more time moving were more exploratory and restless than birds who were stationary. And we figured that if we found differences in the amount of exploratory and restless behavior among light treatments, especially in the light compared to darkness, this would lend some support to the light attraction hypothesis. So to summarize, I wanted to determine if puffin and petrel fledglings exhibit more exploratory and restless behavior in light versus dark conditions, and in certain types of light over others. So it's similar sort of questions to the Y-maze, except this is more just about general activity patterns and whether they're moving and exploring and more restless, rather than directed movement toward lights. So I'll give a little explanation of the graph before I actually show the data on the graph. The graph I'm going to show you has all the different light treatments along the bottom that I use in the experiment. So warm white LED, cool white LED, darkness, and high pressure sodium, being HPS. And the vertical axis is the amount of time the birds spent moving around measured in seconds, hence the little S in brackets. And essentially what I'm going to reveal are some boxes where the higher up they go on the vertical axis, like this one, the more the birds moved around in that light treatment. And if the boxes are lower, like this, those birds in that light treatment did not move around as much. So I found that puffins spent significantly more time and in the dark than in the cool white LED treatment. So big arrows being dark and high pressure sodium are a lot of activity, and cool LED having lower activity. And what's also interesting is that if I remove the outlier in this little circle that just came up at the top of the warm LED treatment, suddenly both LED lights resulted in significantly less movement by the puffins when compared to darkness and high pressure sodium light. So there's obviously something going on with those LED lights that are suppressing activity for whatever reason. And I still have no idea what that reason could be. Perhaps LED light has some sort of calming effect on the birds, but I really don't know yet. I just find this super interesting, and I'm going to have to explore it a little further. And as for the petrels, what I found was totally different from the puffins. They're much more active in the warm LED light and in the high pressure sodium than in the dark. And so movement was a bit higher in the cool LED, as you can see there, compared to darkness, but it wasn't higher enough to be considered statistically different from the amount of activity of darkness. So similar to puffins, petrels were very exploratory and restless in high pressure sodium light. You see how the HPS box on both graphs is pretty high, but they're pretty different from puffins in being less exploratory in the dark and more exploratory in the warm LED light. And so you can see the differences between the two graphs there are quite stark, actually. And again, I don't really know what could be causing these differences. They're not at all what I expected based on the light attraction hypothesis, thinking that birds would be really restless and exploratory in the light and really calm and not moving around much in the dark. That's not really what I found much. Maybe more for petrels, but not for puffins at all. I think the petrels might simply be more comfortable and content in the dark, which is similar to what I found with them in the Y maze, where they just chose to remain in the starting part of the maze, right? They didn't go down either of the arms. And if they did, it was only toward the dark. So they seemed to like the dark for some reason. And in the light, it almost seemed like they were moving around more in order to try and find a place to hide. Because sometimes they'd be scratching in the corners and trying to dig their way out, the poor things. So I do have a weird feeling about how they just don't like the light, whereas puffins are kind of the opposite in that way.
Actually, I should mention that too. Anecdotally, I noted that the puffins were acting more frantic in the dark treatment, and so you can see that reflected in how they moved more in the dark. But again, I have no idea why they'd move that much in the dark, because they're freaked out in the dark, but also move that amount in the high pressure sodium light. It's a mystery that I have to figure out. So to recap the results from that open field test, we found that petrels exhibit more exploratory and restless behavior in light versus darkness, as you saw, where the warm LED and high pressure sodium movement was higher than in the dark. And we found that puffin fledglings were more exploratory and restless in the dark and high pressure sodium light treatments compared to cool LED. So again, as I mentioned, this result doesn't really support what we expected based on the light attraction hypothesis, but it does lead to some interesting questions about why puffins would behave differently in LED light compared to other light types or compared to darkness. So the third and final experiment I'm going to briefly go over, and I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I think I'm talking a little bit fast, actually, is the one that I did this summer that I mentioned and that Dean mentioned during the puffin fledging season. So I wanted to determine if puffin fledglings exhibit phototaxis in not only in our little Y maze choice test that I detailed in the beginning, but also in sort of larger scale field conditions, that is in real life on an actual coastline. I wanted to do sort of, as the experiment suggests, an in-situ choice test rather than a little controlled Y maze choice test. So I assembled a crew of volunteers plus my 2 field assistants, and we set up 2 different sites on either side of the town of Witless Bay, Newfoundland. And Dean, you'll recognize the breeding colony island there as being the one that you went around with O'Brien's on the boat tour. And so the Witless Bay area gets a couple hundred stranded puffin fledglings showing up every year in August. And so I chose my 2 sites on either side of the town of Witless Bay based on their relatively equal distance from the island breeding colony, and also for their relative darkness compared to the town, because I wanted to be able to influence the light levels myself. I didn't want to rely on, the town light levels. I wanted to manipulate it for this experiment. So I bought a super bright light, and each night for 11 nights, I turned that light on at one of the two beaches. So every night, one of the beaches was lit up, one of them was dark. And we alternated which beach had the light on each night. So for example, the first night, beach 1 was lit up, and on the second night, beach 2 was lit up, and we alternated back and forth like that. And we simply counted puffin fledglings that showed up at the two sites simultaneously and recorded their behaviors. So for example, we recorded whether they were swimming or flying, and which direction they were traveling, and whether they approached the light, and generally just taking all sorts of notes, because funny enough, as basic as this experiment is, and as basic as those behaviors are that we're recording, no one's ever done this, and no one has actually ever observed stranding behaviors directly and recorded them systematically. It's entirely anecdotal up till this point. So, oh, and I just wanted to show also, this is sort of what it looked like on the beach when the light was on. It was very bright. I still don't know exactly how bright. It's somewhere between 50 and 100,000 lumens. It's the kind of light that you put on a 4x4 or a Jeep if you're going off-roading or something like that. And I ran it off of car batteries. So yeah, it was pretty bright. And what we found was pretty amazing. I don't have any data for this experiment on the slides because I haven't compiled the numbers yet. But it was something like over the course of the 11 nights of the experiment, we had about 100 puffin fledglings show up to the beaches when they were lit, but only one, a single bird, showed up over the whole course of the experiment to the beaches when they were dark. So literally one night on the dark beach, we had one bird, and every night on the light beach, we had birds. So that was pretty amazing result to see, like, okay, you know, the light is bringing them in, at least for a certain distance away. So very cool. And I took this video. I even had one puffin who decided it wanted to come right up to my feet when I shone my headlamp on it. I only shone my headlamp on it to try and take the video of the bird being in the water. And then it actually swam ashore while I was still watching and videotaping. And it did this. So as you can see, it came right up to my feet. And actually, I stopped taking the video at this moment and literally just grabbed it with one hand. So don't try this at home. Don't, you know, go to Newfoundland and do this. I was, you know, I had all the federal permits and animal care approval, blah, blah, blah. But it was just sort of amazing to have this bird, you know, become entrained in my headlamp light and walk right up to my feet as long as I kept sort of trailing it toward me with my light. So that convinced me pretty easily that, you know, light attraction is probably a thing, at least for puffins. And this sort of verifies what I found in the Y-maze choice test too, right? Where they did go toward the light compared to darkness, and they went toward the brighter light more than toward the dim light. So yeah, this sort of in situ field size choice test across an entire coastline does confirm those results that the puffins are drawn toward the light. I have not done this experiment with the petrels yet, and I don't think I will, because it's quite a different way that they get stranded. As you saw in that video at the beginning of the presentation where they were hitting the building, it's not really the same behavior as the puffins. And I think there are a lot more differences in behavior between puffins and petrels than people previously gave credit for. Just based on my observations in the field, they get stranded in quite different ways, and they seem to be affected by lights in different ways also. And so, just to summarize a little bit, what have we learned through these 3 experiments? Well, we learned that puffin fledglings exhibit light attraction behavior in controlled experiments, but that petrels appear to avoid light wherever possible. And we also know that neither species seems to prefer certain light types over others. We also learned that certain types of light appear to make puffins and petrels more or less exploratory. It's something that I didn't, honestly, I'll admit it, in the back of my head, I didn't expect any differences. I thought they were all just going to be random amounts of activity and random, types of light. And, if light attraction is true, I thought, okay, maybe they'll be more exploratory in the light. But they seem to, as I mentioned, show a lot of different, very unexpected behaviors in the different light types. And so to sum up, based on these experiments, these three that I've described, I found mixed support for the light attraction hypothesis, but there is much stronger support for puffins being attracted to light than petrels. That being said, how can we apply our knowledge to the prevention of seabird strandings? Well, we can provide places for petrels to hide in the dark. This is a video that I took of petrels hiding in a rat poison box. And I think this one actually didn't have poison. That's a whole other story. They started deploying these boxes because they noticed petrels hiding in the boxes that did have rat poison around this fish plant. So they started putting unpoisoned boxes out, and lo and behold, the petrels use them to hide. So the nice thing about using those for conservation anyway, is that the petrels can hide and be comfortable, and also, most importantly, protected from predation until they can be rescued. So that's one thing we can do based on our knowledge that the petrels, at least when they're on the ground, they go away from the light and they want to hide. We also know that we can change from using a lot of unnecessary lighting outdoors at night to turning off all that unnecessary lighting to try and prevent strandings from happening in the first place. And this was some research being done by a student at Memorial University at the same time as my experiments, where she counted the number of petrels that got stranded when the fish plant lights were on. And you can see how huge that building is in the top picture versus when the plant lights were off. And this is the exact building I was saying that got 1,000 birds stranded around it in one night. So you can see just the sheer size of it. So those are some things that we can do to apply our knowledge and try to prevent and mitigate seabird strandings and to help the birds that do get stranded. And just to mention briefly some of the future work that I'm hoping to do so that maybe you'll follow me on Twitter. Next year, I'm hoping to figure out the exact reasons why moon phase seems to influence the number of fledglings that get stranded. And I also want to study why petrels hit the walls of buildings before they get stranded. So again, that fish plant video that I showed you where the birds hit the walls and fall to the ground. Typically, at least from what I observed in person in real life, if the birds don't hit the walls, they'll fly around a bit and then they'll just leave. But the birds, unfortunately, who do hit the walls, and it does seem to be related to the light shining off of those walls, those are the birds that obviously get really disoriented because they fall. They've got, possibly varying degrees of head trauma. And then that's when they're really vulnerable and they're on the ground and they're not very able to take off again. So I would like to look at how we can possibly prevent those building collisions so that we can prevent them from getting stranded on the ground in the first place. And quick shameless plug as an aside, if you're interested, I just had an open access paper come out recently that discusses seabird strandings and light attraction and possible alternative hypotheses or different causes of strandings in a lot more detail. And since it's open access, you can find it just by Googling the title. So feel free to do that and read up on it if you're interested. And otherwise, thank you so much for watching my talk, and I look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Taylor. That was great.
Appreciate it very much. Sharing, if that's better. There we go.
That was great, and great to hear in detail the research you were doing, because I knew I was volunteering potentially to sit on the beach, but I didn't hear about the first part of the experiment. So that's great. And we're sitting here listening and going, geez, we missed that.
Well, maybe next year you'll be back.
And actually, there was quite this discussion prior to when we volunteered. And I said, we'll be assigned to a beach and it'll be what it is. But my wife's insisting, no, I want a beach with light. I want to hold puffins. That's what it was. So we had
Well,
quite.
there would have been a lot, yes, as I found out. Which it was funny because I started out the experiment being on the light beach because I thought, okay, if problems arise and there's birds coming in, I want to be there. I want to figure out, if anything goes wrong with the light, I want to be there. And the whole experiment kept going each night with like either things going wrong or like me not figuring everything out. And so I literally just was at the lighted beach every single night. So I never even saw the dark beach.
Probably not much to see, to be honest.
No, no birds.
Well, excellent. Well, great talk. Oh, sorry. My Alexa speaking to me. Great talk. Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into chat. I know, Taylor, do you want me to read them out to you? Do you want to read them yourself?
I see them here, yeah. So the first one looks like high pressure sodium light has a narrow spectral range. Have you investigated whether puffins versus petrels have a different spectral sensitivity? Now that is $1 million question. The sad, unfortunate thing is there's very, very few people in the world who are studying seabird spectral sensitivities. I know a couple people at the University of Hawaii who are, and I've actually had a couple different Zoom calls with a grad student there who's studying the spectral sensitivities of some of the seabirds affected by stranding. But those are like shearwaters in Hawaii. They haven't done it on puffins or on storm-petrels. That being said, of course, the life history is very similar between shearwaters and storm-petrels. And so we can make some assumptions. And there's some, inferences that you can make about spectral sensitivities, even without directly measuring them using retinas dissected from recently dead birds, because that's the main way of doing that. And I guess the short answer is we don't really know if there's any nuanced differences between puffins and petrels in their spectral sensitivities. They are different in their foraging. Like obviously puffins are divers, so they need to see more in that violet range of the spectrum once they're getting down a bit deeper when the red light disappears. Whereas storm-petrels are very much surface foragers, and so they might not need that extreme sort of violet end sensitivity. So yeah, short answer is we don't really know, and I myself don't have the tools or the lab, equipment necessary to do that kind of study. But it very well is possible given their very large divergence in evolution and their differences in natural history and foraging that they do have different spectral sensitivities. Sorry for the very long answer.
That's a great answer.
Okay, next one. That is the next one. Yeah, I remember taking a road trip in Iceland a few years ago and seeing lots of stranded northern fulmars on the road. I would like to hear about that, if you don't mind emailing me possibly. My email is just taylorbrown@trentu.ca, TRENTU.ca. Because fulmars would be a very interesting one. I've looked through the literature. I was going to do a meta-analysis on the topic. And that's how I found that diurnal birds, so birds that fledge during the day, who feed during the day and do everything during the daytime, are not susceptible to stranding. And I was interested in fulmars because they are tube noses, right? I believe. Right? Yes. And so I was curious if they get stranded at all. And I found zero evidence in the literature that they get stranded. So I would like to hear from you, if you don't mind. Do the strandings go on all night, or is there a variation with the time of the night? That one was very cool. It was a very cool observation that nobody really knew about much. There's a volunteer rescue program in Newfoundland for puffins, and they do their rescue program between, I think it's 8 p.m. and midnight, and they have the two different shifts of volunteers that go out. And they sort of had a general idea of when the strandings came in most during the night. But during my experiment, it was very specific. It was like when I lit up the beach, it was like 9:30, I think I started it. And the birds would start showing up like clockwork at about 9:45. And it would stop at about 10:20, or not stop, but they'd start dropping off at about 10:20. So it was this period of about 45 minutes that was like the peak. And I have no idea why. Again, that's something that I'd like to find out when I'm hoping to go to the colony this upcoming summer and actually monitor departures from the nest and look at not only day departures and what factors might influence the day they choose to fledge, but also the timing. But yeah, so they do seem to go around 10 p.m. for some reason. With the petrels, it was a bit more spread out. They fledged. We were finding birds right up until 2 in the morning, and they would start around 9. So they were a bit more spread out for some reason. Again, not sure why. And last one, do adult birds behave differently towards light than fledglings? That's also a super interesting one, and it's covered in the literature pretty well. Like I mentioned in my talk how there isn't a lot of literature on the topic, period. But what is on there, what is in the literature, they do discuss how adult seabirds don't tend to get stranded nearly as much as fledglings. It's usually about 99% fledglings in terms of all the stranded birds that they find. And so yeah, the adults don't nearly get stranded as often. And there's been a couple of experiments that people conducted, both actually mostly on the colony, the breeding colony, where they would shine different colors and different spectra of lights and see how the adults behaved, and then they would see how the fledglings behaved. And the adults seem to be more avoidant of the light, and that kind of checks out with the observations of adults not getting stranded. The thing that I didn't mention in my talk was that at least with storm-petrels, they're quite small birds, right? And they don't weigh very much. I think they're only about 40 grams. And one of the biggest predictors of storm-petrels getting stranded is winds. And they've actually found this also with shearwaters in Australia, where if the winds are onshore, and especially if the winds are strong, that's when you find more birds stranded. And so where this comes into age is that the fledglings just leaving the nest don't really have super well developed flight muscles, whereas the adults, of course, have, the best flight muscles out there because they're, at least a year old. They've been flying in storms and all kinds of weather and winds, their whole life. And so I observed that directly too, where we would get a few stranded adult Leach's storm-petrels, but when we would go to release them, we would hold out our hand and the bird would just shoot straight out over the ocean. Whereas the fledglings, you'd hold them out and they'd be all floppy and the wind would blow them off my hand and you'd have to go pick them up again and they'd get flap, flap, flap and try to, get going really fast. And then they'd finally, with a lot of effort, manage to take off. And so, again, that's not really a difference in behavior toward light between adults and fledglings, but it is part of the difference, we think, in terms of, wind can more easily blow fledglings on shore than adults. Whew, sorry. And cut me off, Dean, if I'm going too long.
We're going good. Well done.
Do these birds have any preference moving towards the left versus right when in a confined space? Maybe more pertinent in experiment 1. That was something that I didn't mention, but I built it into the experiment where I actually switched which side the light was on each time. So I flipped a coin as to which bird went in first. I just had the lights set up a certain way. Or no, I just flipped a coin as to where the lights were, sorry. And then, with alternating birds, I just switched the light and I cleaned the whole Y maze in between. Because we know that storm-petrels have a really good sense of smell. And so I didn't want them possibly following the scent of the other bird down the tube. So I cleaned the whole apparatus with alcohol between birds. And then, yeah, switched the lights positions between birds, because that was something I was a bit nervous about too, is that they would just keep going down left or all right. So yeah, super interesting. Oh, thank you, Nina. And so, do adults show learning behavior that could explain that they avoid attraction to light? Super good question. I don't think there's any research on that so far, but that would definitely be one of the next areas to look at. I think adults certainly do have that component, because a lot of researchers have posited this who study these birds, even if it's not in the research or in the literature. Just that adults, they even have like more well-developed eyes. When tube-nosed seabirds are just leaving their nest as fledglings, their eyes actually aren't fully developed yet. Even though their sense of smell is fully developed because they use that extensively for foraging, their sense of sight is not fully developed yet, whereas the adults do have fully developed eyes, even if they don't have the best vision. And so learning is probably part of it. The adults are more experienced. They know what prey looks like. They know what the moon looks like. They know what stars look like. And they can probably differentiate better between those natural sources of light at night and the anthropogenic sources. But yeah, maybe eye development also has something to do with it. Oh, Audrey, thank you. That's very sweet.
And I think Audrey has said it well for all of us. We thank you very much for that very clear illustration of your work and the results you found so far. And we're excited to follow you along as you finish this work and learn more about light attraction with our seabird colonies and what we can do about it. I mean, something more dear to us here in Southern Ontario, as you're well aware, is, you know, the whole campaign to decrease lights in buildings during bird migration, you know, the light out. So there's extrapolation there, I'm sure. And we did have a speaker a while ago from Western speak about such work, who did actually similar mazes to yours to test
Really?
the house finches that he caught at Home Depot to see how they moved in light.
Do you happen to remember the name of the person?
You broke up there. Brandon Samuels was the speaker.
Oh, okay. I know him. Okay, I'll ask him about it.
Yeah. So
cool.
But thank you. That was awesome. We really appreciate it. It was great to bring that to light. And yes, we look forward to hearing more.
Thanks for having me so much.
She needs in Newfoundland next summer.
Oh, yes. My wife wants to know if you need us in Newfoundland next summer.
Sure. You're gonna be there.
To be negotiated. Okay.
I'll be there.
Excellent.